Try to remember being 3 years old. Not a photograph of yourself at 3. Not a story someone told you about what you were like. An actual memory. Something you saw, heard, felt, from inside your own experience at that age. For most people, there's almost nothing there. A few fragments, maybe. An image without context. A feeling without a scene. And then, before a certain point, just silence. You were alive. You were conscious. You were forming relationships, learning language, experiencing the world with enormous emotional intensity. And almost none of it stayed. The reason is far stranger than you've been told. Most people assume they simply forgot, the way you forget what you had for lunch 3 weeks ago. Memory fades. That seems obvious. But that explanation doesn't actually hold up, because young children have excellent short-term memory. Toddlers remember things. They recognize faces, learn words, form habits, remember where their toys are. The forgetting isn't happening at the input stage. Something else is happening, and it begins before you were even old enough to ask what memory was. To understand it, you have to go inside the developing brain, specifically to a region called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the brain's primary structure for converting short-term experiences into long-term memories. In adults, it works continuously, tagging experiences, encoding them, filing them away for later retrieval. But in early childhood, the hippocampus is still under construction. Neuroscientist Paul Franklin and his colleagues studied this directly, and what they found overturned a lot of assumptions. The hippocampus doesn't just grow slowly, it's actively generating new neurons at an extremely high rate during early childhood, a process called neurogenesis. And here's the counterintuitive part. That rapid growth actually disrupts the existing memory network rather than building it up. New neurons integrating into the hippocampus interfere with previously stored circuits. The very process that is building your brain is simultaneously erasing the earliest traces it laid down. This gives childhood amnesia a biological mechanism that nobody expected. It isn't that your brain failed to record your early experiences. It's that the brain was so rapidly rebuilding itself that the records kept getting overwritten before they could stabilize into lasting memories. There's a second layer here, one that's more cultural than biological, and it explains why the precise age at which your memories begin varies so much from person to person. Psychologist Chi Wang spent years studying childhood memory across different cultures and found something that surprised many researchers. Children in cultures that emphasize storytelling and personal narrative, particularly Western cultures, where parents frequently ask children to recount their day, to describe how they felt, to explain what happened, those children develop their earliest accessible memories at a younger age than children in cultures where this kind of autobiographical narration is less emphasized. Chinese children, on average, show an earliest memory boundary nearly 6 months later than American children. The memories themselves aren't different. The scaffolding that holds them in place is. What this tells you is that memory isn't simply a recording that happens automatically. It's a construction. It requires language, narrative structure, a sense of self stable enough to serve as the anchor point for a story. A 2-year-old may have an intense emotional experience, and without the linguistic and narrative tools to encode it as a story with a beginning and middle and end, the experience registers but leaves no retrievable trace. It's not that you were too young to experience things. You were too young to tell yourself the story of what you were experiencing, and the story is what memory runs on. This connects directly to what developmental psychologist Catherine Nelson called the emergence of the autobiographical self. Before around age 2, children have what researchers describe as functional memory that shapes behavior, that teaches the brain what to expect, that builds habits and associations, but that doesn't produce a continuous, retrievable first-person narrative. The self that will eventually look back and remember hasn't fully assembled itself yet. And you can't remember events that happened before the rememberer existed. Here's something that almost no one talks about when they discuss childhood amnesia, and it might be the most unsettling part. Those early experiences are not simply gone. They shaped you in ways that left no accessible memory trail, but left deep marks on everything else. The attachment patterns you formed with caregivers in your first 2 years are among the most well-documented influences on how you form relationships as an adult. and you can access almost none of the experiences that produce them. The emotional responses that feel most automatic and most deeply yours, the ones that seem to come from nowhere, were in many cases laid down before your conscious memory system was operational. You are, in a real sense, shaped by a period of your life you will never be able to remember. And the version of you that exists now cannot go back and retrieve the raw material that built it. Think about what that means for the way you understand yourself, the story you tell about who you are, about where your personality came from, about what formed you, necessarily has a gap at the beginning. Not because nothing happened, but because the recording system for accessible memory wasn't yet running. The foundation was being poured before the cameras were on. This is also why early childhood trauma is so difficult to work with clinically. The events themselves may be entirely inaccessible to conscious recall, while their effects remain vividly present in the nervous system, in emotional patterns, in physical responses that arise without any narrative explanation. The body can remember what the mind cannot narrate. The therapeutic challenge is often not retrieving the memory because the explicit memory may genuinely not exist, but working with the emotional and physiological residue it left behind. There's something almost philosophical about this that's worth sitting with for a moment. You were a conscious, experiencing being for the first 2 to 4 years of your life, and that version of you is entirely inaccessible to the version of you reading this now. Not because you changed, though you did, but because the mechanism that would have made continuity possible wasn't yet in place when that earlier version of you was doing the living. The self you experience as continuous, as the same person who woke up yesterday and who will wake up tomorrow, is built on a foundation you can't see and can't visit. And the child who laid that foundation, who was frightened and delighted and confused and loved, is someone you will never directly remember being, only hear about secondhand the way you'd hear about a stranger who happened to share your name. Try to remember being 3 years old. The silence isn't an absence of experience. It's the cost of having a brain that was so busy becoming itself that it couldn't hold on to the proof.